You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The question I had, and then this is more of a personal question for you, but it's like, do you see like sometime in the future, an endpoint to your podcast? And I don't mean like, okay, I've had enough, I'm giving up this, but more like, you know, you're satisfied with like the work that you've done. You don't have a lot more to say. Do you kind of see an endpoint?
I am pleased to be joined by Kevan. How are you, Kevan?
I'm doing well.
Thanks for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. How long do you think you've been listening?
Well, when I originally wrote to you, I thought it was about 15, 16 years or so, and I just kind of was thinking about it. Well, my dad passed away about 14 years ago. We had some conversations up to that point regarding history, and it's like I'd been listening to you for like a few years before that, so it's probably more like 17, 18, something like that. I don't think I was right at the beginning, but somewhere near it, I guess.
Actually, I'm kind of glad because I feel like the first 3 years, the mic wasn't good, file size issues, I think that after that's where it really started hitting stride and we started doing some larger episodes. And
yeah, I just remember I had like one of those old iPods, the one with a circle in the middle.
Yes.
I like one of the first or second generation, something like that. And I was looking on iTunes, it's like podcasts. Like, what is that? Found a few that I liked, and there's a couple others that I've been listening to that like the time, but yours, just the title of it caught my attention. And it's like, and I'm a little bit of a student of history, not quite a history buff, but I like listening, reading about history and finding out stuff like what happens in our past.
I remember reading a book, an early book about podcasting, and they said, spend a lot of time on the title. Because even in 2006, believe it or not, like there were already a bunch of podcasts, already hundreds of them. So they were saying, well, you got to stand out. How are you going to stand out? I said, well, it's not good enough to just have a podcast about hockey. You have to do like a podcast about goalies. That's what and I still say that. So I just took a bunch of things and said, what are you interested in? Okay, history and politics, and started writing, probably spent an afternoon writing names. And then had a bunch of different ones. History Sandwich was a possible. Histropolitics was a possible. I'm glad I didn't pick those. It's been hard to always beat up current politics with history over time, especially as things changed from a more kind of traditional president in Congress, political campaigns. This is where I think the early episodes, at least for me, I wasn't really almost glad you didn't hear as many of them because they had a lesson at the end, and I stopped doing that. It's like the lessons and what you hear in it.
And that's one of the things I liked about at least the early days of your show is that stuff was happening like today, 16, 17 years ago, but you gave it some historical perspective, and it's like, well, this happened and this happened, and this, so it kind of gave a little bit of historical perspective of what was going on. Sometimes it gave me like food for thought. It's like, okay, I can see, how this came about. And, I really enjoyed that. And and I imagine that's kind of hard to keep up with, especially with, today's politics where things are just changing, like almost an hourly basis sometimes.
Yeah, it's I was just joking on another listener call I did where it's like, remember Venezuela? We were supposed to start the year with a war in Venezuela, so I was doing research on war powers, and by the time I finished and put the episode out, things mostly resolved. So it's things like that are occurring, new things are occurring. Now the premise of the show is, never that there's nothing new in history. I love all that stuff like history rhymes or history doesn't say goodbye. It just says see you later. These more fuzzy ways of saying it because there's always new events. The Bush administration, in many ways, and of course you can't say Bush administration, the 9/11 events are very new events that just changed a lot. And how could politics be the same? So we're always applying history. We're always applying history the best we can. Maybe this is somewhat. If Huey Long, for instance, which there was major possibility that if he lived, that he could have been a competitor to Roosevelt, given him problems, possibly become independent candidate for president. Who knows? There's a guy that if he were president, you'd be seeing very similar things to what you're seeing. Just a way that a president approaches the office, the rapidity of taking actions, a lot of I'm sure there would have been a lot of executive orders, a lot of pronouncements. And in fairness, I'll point out that for opponents of Franklin Roosevelt, to them is very much what opponents today experience with Trump. It's like all this stuff's happening so fast. Why is he taking all these powers? Why is he there? There was that. They had no idea what would have been coming if they went with if Huey Long was able to say defeat Roosevelt in a primary. He would brag about that he got Roosevelt in office because he campaigned for him like couple of stops in the Midwest. He said, I pulled those states in for you. They're almost sorry for having him speak for the Roosevelt campaign because in 32, because then he just took credit for the whole Roosevelt presidency and the win. So that was the kind of guy he was, but he gets shot in 35, I believe. So he's out of the picture. Had we had that example of a President Huey Long, I don't think even something as different as Donald Trump, say, becoming president, you'd have a comparable.
Definitely.
Yeah. So, by the way, tell me a little about yourself or whatever you're willing to share.
Yeah. I live up here in Maine.
Okay.
Born and raised here in Maine. Lived here all my life. I'm actually like a ninth or 10th generation Mainer. So a lot of my ancestors came over in like the 1630, 1640, stuff like that. Over from England. Just like I did one of those 23andMe tests, and I'm like 99.3% British Isles. So not a lot of variation there.
That is a lot. That is very heavy. I got some British, but it's certainly not 98.
James, the whole, I had some relatives that fought in the Revolutionary War, some that fought in the Civil War. You go back that far, and you've got like, lots and lots of great grandparents. So it's like you kind of like pick and choose and stuff like that. And actually, like, my grandmother is the youngest of 10 of Irish immigrants. Got a little bit of Irish there too. That only came, they came over in like the 1890s. So it's, but still, it's all British Isles.
Well, exactly, because that gets difficult. One thing that people always have to keep in mind is what is one of the number one nationalities in Britain and in England, we could even use that term in this case, is Ireland. So there's Irish British. And one of the things, so they're there and they might not always be recorded well until you do the DNA portion of the ancestry. And then you start seeing it show up and wait, I thought everybody was British in their County Cork and because they didn't just come to America, they also came to Britain, and Liverpool is an Irish city, Manchester's. I've also recently done my nationality, and yeah, good amount of British, good amount of German, Swedish.
So, you get so far back and it's just, kind of meaningless after a point, because then you've got like thousands and thousands of ancestors.
Do you have any kind of question for me about the podcast, about history, about politics, story and history that you like a lot? And
one thing I really like about Maine history, I found this out a little while ago, and for this, there's something called the Aroostook War, and basically it was like 1838, stuff like that, and basically there was a dispute over like the northern border of Maine, and at that time the British still had Canada,
right?
So there was kind of dispute, and they call it the Aroostook War. They're really, I found out there's never really like an armed conflict. They settled through a treaty and whatnot, but the state of Maine did send some militia up to like northern Maine and some of the soldiers did die, but mostly, like it's 1838. A lot of it was like from disease.
Oh,
Uh,
right. Of
there were
course.
like, like 30, like 37 died from disease, and one died from like some sort of accident. I didn't.
I mean,
So
in those days, I mean, this is what it was. The worst place you could be would be in an army camp.
right,
The worst place, and the and sending people to war was a dangerous thing, not because of the bullets. And definitely, if you look at the Spanish-American War, it's an unqualified success in every military way. But when you take account the large amounts of, I mean, the deaths that occur because of disease, it's much greater than any Spanish bullets or Cuban bullets, um, you know, inflicted. And there were some battles that were pretty rough, but similar times, yeah, you never wanted to be in a camp or mobilizing an army, getting groups of men together. Not good for hygiene, not good for health. Maine, so the British had their eye on it a little bit during 1812. They occupied it for a small time. They
right.
thought that there was some speculation. I wouldn't go any farther than that. Maybe talk in the parlors of London in liberal party circles that if the British intervened in the Civil War, that's one way they would do it. They had a claim on Maine and they would just take it. You see that Maine contributes to the North in the Civil War. Of course, the VP Hannibal Hamlin from
Mhm.
Maine. Um, I've talked about him in the past, where I think if you say Hannibal Hamlin now, for most people, they're like, well, that's Lincoln's VP. And he didn't do much. And that's true, because VPs in the 19th century didn't do much. In fact, at one point, he joins the Maine militia. He leaves D.C. and he's peeling potatoes. But Hamlin was a great senator, was a great speaker. And in his time, when Lincoln was in Congress, Hamlin would have been much more famous and much more well regarded as a speaker, as a person you wanted on your side in debates. And Blaine is an interesting character. I get a little inspired because we were talking about Maine, but Blaine is funny because he's from Kentucky originally, and in fact, he as a school teacher, he was very pro Southern, pro institution of slavery, at least whatever code words they would have used, like our peculiar institution, the way things need to be, whatever. He was a school teacher, and he would drill it into the kids that this is the way that this is the way we are in the South. This is the way it has to be. And then I suppose it was the schoolmaster's daughter that he fell in love with, and then went back to Maine with her, and became, of course, an abolitionist or near that, and a Republican, and all the right politics for that state. Newspaper editor, really good writer, really good newspaper editor, and then worked his way up. But at one point, he was talking to some Southerner and said, like, and the Southerner said, "Yeah, you're the one that told you're the one that convinced my kids to join the Confederate Army. They were in your class, and you drilled it into them that they should be pro-Southern rights and that the Yankees were on their freedoms and things." And so that's my interesting Maine Blaine story. Do you listen to other podcasts they like?
I do. A couple that I've listened to probably as long as yours. There's one called Astronomy Cast,
Okay,
which and they talk about obviously about astronomy. And there's one called Skeptoid,
I know
which is
Skeptoid.
yeah. And I've listened to that as long as I've listened to your show. And I listen
Hmm.
to others as well. It's like I've got you know I started listening to the what is it, the Fiasco podcast. I got it all downloaded. I haven't listened to it yet, but I listened to the one on the AIDS crisis and the one regarding what it
He did
was.
Iran Contra. He
Yeah,
did
I
the
haven't listened to
Bush
that one.
election, the
Oh
2000
no,
election.
the 2000 election.
Yeah, yeah.
That and going into depth on those. That was just you know a, amazing amount of detail, and you know I have some opinions about how that went, but that's neither here nor there at this point.
It's one you could study a lot. I think the more I study it, I get more confused. Um, and I will still always, my own position is that Florida woke up in the morning voting for Gore.
Right.
Whether they achieved it or not by the afternoon, where they all did the right things, where they all went to the polls even, whether they achieved it by the end of the day, it's very hard to say. That's where you get into this like back and forth. And I
Mm.
know there's been recounts and audits, but a lot of that the methodology isn't clear. The other thing that has always struck me about 2000, I think he went into it a little bit in that, but I've heard in other things as well, and doing my own research, is the military voting. And I was like, well, they didn't have to stamp the military votes.
Right.
So they allowed them after the election, and there was an orchestrated campaign to now service. We want our service people to vote, and so it was an issue that was untouchable. But at the same time, those votes were not all cast within the normal election period, and certain number, I don't know how many, were cast with the knowledge that this was a contested state, and you need to get your thing in. So yeah, it's a very rich story.
Yeah,
There were things, candidates
I've
going
been
to the Supreme Court to decide who's going to be president. That's not, we haven't had that exactly. I mean, I don't know that may happen in the future, but you know,
yeah, I've been voting since 1980 for for president, and it's just like this. Sometimes it's like this is history. Watching just keep an eye on it because it's you're watching history as it happens.
yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Each thing that occurs, every election, I'm always watching midterms. So now I've done the show for 20 years. Now there's history within the time period that I've done the show. So I have one coming out soon on the 2002 midterms. That's 20 years. That's more than 20 years. That's 24 years. But yeah, no, I really do appreciate the long listenership that you've given me. I enjoy it as I think as much as hopefully people enjoy listening to it. I learned quite a bit. Any final thoughts? Any questions?
Um, well, I had one final question, but it might be require a long answer. So the question I had, and then this is more of a personal question for you, but it's like,
Sure.
uh, do you see like like sometime in the future, an endpoint to your podcast? And I don't mean like okay, I've had enough, I'm giving up this, but more like you know you're satisfied with like the work that you've done. You don't have a lot more to say. Do you kind of see an endpoint to
Like a Wittgenstein, like there's nothing more to say.
right?
Like famous, philosopher who he just did his tract. I guess it was the tractatus, and at
Right.
the end of it, it was all these one sentence things, and then it was like, and now there's language can do nothing more for us, so I will say nothing more. And so that's a great question. Thank you, wonderful question, and the answer is no. To me, the answer is no. There's no way. So, barring physical inability to do it, which could certainly happen. I mean, I'm getting older and all of that
Right.
stuff, or time, or a job that takes away all of that stuff. But just in terms of what you're asking me, no, because there's still all the time there's subjects that I have to get to. So I did Taylor, started the research in 2023, had it in a box, legal pads. I use generally legal pads, and that's how I can combobulate things from different sources. Is getting it onto a legal pad, and then you sometimes using a second legal pad. I do use some computer now, but not limited for the shorter episodes. The episode about student loans had been in the work for like 10 years. The USSR was since 2010, and I only got it out in 2022.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
lot of
Yeah.
stuff that I have that are like, oh, it'd be nice to do a full series, a thicker look at things. And so I think it's like the more you know, the less you know kind of thing. So you're doing a little bit of research or learning about something, and then you're like, God, I wish I really have time to really delve into that or to see, is that assumption right? What does that really mean? And there's a whole bunch of, I think there'll always be topics, and then new people will be president. And, but I could run out of time to do it with a different, I've always been lucky that the jobs that I've had, and generally the podcast you're listening to is done by a guy who has almost always had a full-time job during the time. And not small. I was like product manager for significant busy, but it was enough that I could still do things. I mean, in the old days, I was printing things out of the office printer and doing research at lunch. Now I'm at home, and that helps a lot. Since 2020, that's helped a lot. But so there's always a chance that a job could change to where they won't allow you any time where you could never do it again, and then it'll just become infrequent. Like when I started the podcast, I was only doing one a month or one every 2 months. It wasn't that frequent, I could go there, but not in terms of what I believe you're talking about, which is more the subject matter, or is there anything left to say?
Right.
No, there's not. It's a great question you bring up. So if you know Robert Caro, the guy that writes the books about Lyndon Johnson, and he writes like the big, solid books. Look at what he's done. So history, like, is a combination of all these lives that happen in minutes and hours and days. And so if you're going to decide to pick a subject and go in such detail like Robert Caro say does on Lyndon Johnson's boyhood, on his Senate career, on his vice presidency, on his presidency, the amount of time it takes to obviously do that is always more than the lived life of the person, much more. He's spending 30 hours to find out one event that occurred. Like, I think he talked about there was one conversation with Lyndon Johnson's brother. They caught him in a lie, but in order to catch that lie that Lyndon Johnson's brother had told about the relationship between LBJ and the father for years and years and years, this lie. And in 30 hours probably of research and actually going and living in Lyndon Johnson's town, which Robert Caro did for a while, getting the trust of people, he realized through enough sources triangulating that the brother told a lie. And it was about the relationship between the father. And I think essentially the brother always said that they were fighting all the time. And that's not really the case. It wasn't that Lyndon Johnson hated his father, nothing like that. It was, I believe, Lyndon Johnson thought his father was getting taken advantage of all the time. Didn't hate him, didn't fight with him that much. It was just that. And it was, I'm not going to be like that. And the brother kind of had told the story that never happened about an argument. And then he had to cough it up after Caro said, this is just not true. So if you're going to do that with history, just imagine, and there's all these different subjects you could pick. So I don't think you ever run out. I don't think you ever say everything that has been said. I also do believe there are some things, particularly before, say, 2015, that I might have to go back. And it's like, oh, you know what? I just got that one wrong. I really think after that, I did a pretty good job, usually multiple sources. So, no, wonderful question, Kevin. But now the answer is no, outside of a physical ailment. There won't be a subject ailment or a lack of interest in my part. I mean, this is, I would be reading these books and thinking about this stuff anyway, even if I did no podcast.
Oh,
that's the way I look at it. I was always reading the books. I just started doing the podcast in 2006. Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for coming on, and thanks for listening. And contact me anytime you want, or you have a question or anything.
Okay, awesome.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kevin.